"You belong here now," he had said, the words a deep current beneath the gale's roar. The statement was not a question, not a suggestion, but a truth anchored in the stone beneath their feet. But that came later. First, there was only the fury of the sea, the splintered timber, and a silence hollowed out by the memory of screams. Finian found her on the black, jagged teeth of the shore, where his island tore at the sea's relentless assault. She was a tangle of seaweed and soaked velvet, an offering the ocean had tried and failed to consume. He had been making his rounds after the storm's peak, checking the sea wall for new fractures, when a patch of impossible color against the grey chaos had caught his eye. It was the crimson of her dress, a flag of defiance in a world of slate and foam. He knew the scent of death well, it was the island's most common perfume after a storm. But as he drew closer, another scent cut through the salt and decay, the scent of life, faint and fragile. She was wedged between two basalt pillars, half submerged in a churning tide pool, her body a canvas of deep bruises and cruel abrasions that seemed to map her violent journey. The wreckage of a small, elegant skiff lay shattered around her, its gilded scrollwork a mockery of its fate. At first, he thought she was another soul claimed by the currents he knew so intimately. But then, a shudder. Not from her, but from the oilskin-wrapped bundle clutched to her chest with a grip that defied consciousness. He moved with a speed that belied his massive frame, his heavy boots finding purchase on the slick rock as he descended into the churning water. The cold was a familiar enemy, a thief of warmth and life. He knelt, his large, calloused hands that could mend a winch or carve stone, trembling with a sudden, unfamiliar hesitancy as he brushed the wet, matted hair from her face. It was a face of aristocratic beauty, now a mask of exhaustion and sea salt anguish. Her breath was a whisper, a ghost of a thing he could barely see in the cold air. His gaze fell to the bundle. With the utmost care, he loosened her grip, half expecting the worst. Inside, wrapped in layers of oilskin and wool, was an infant. A boy, his face pale but peaceful, his stillness the terrifying slumber of the deeply chilled. Finian was a man carved from the island itself, granite hard, solitary, and weathered by a lifetime of storms, both literal and personal. But in that moment, seeing the woman's broken form curled protectively around this tiny spark of life, a deep, resonant chord of memory and instinct struck within him. A fierce, protective wave rose from a place he had long thought barren. He did not hesitate. With a gentleness that was almost painful in its precision, he lifted the infant, tucking the bundle securely inside the cavernous warmth of his own oilskin coat. Then he turned back to the woman. He slid his powerful arms beneath her, lifting her from her watery sepulchre. She was impossibly light, as if the sea had already stolen half her substance. As he stood, the broken mother and child held fast against his chest, the great warning horn of his lighthouse boomed its mournful, rhythmic cry across the water, a sound that seemed to speak for all the world's loneliness and loss. Finian turned his back on the ravenous sea and began the arduous climb toward the spire of light that was his home, his life, his prison. The journey back to the lighthouse was a testament to his will. The wind, not yet ready to concede defeat, tore at him, a physical entity that clawed and shrieked, trying to reclaim the souls he had stolen from its grasp. The woman, Lyra, though he did not yet know her name, was a dead weight, her head lolling against his shoulder with each laboured step. He focused on the solid crunch of his boots on the gravel path, the burn of his muscles, the steady, living warmth nestled against his ribs. The lighthouse wasn't a home, it was a fortress. Built of massive, interlocking granite blocks, it had stood for a century against the worst the ocean could conjure. It was his solitary kingdom, a vertical island of light and stone. Pushing the heavy, iron-banded door open with his shoulder, he was met by a wave of dry, blessed heat. The great pot-bellied stove in the ground-floor living chamber, the lighthouse's iron heart, was glowing with a fierce, steady heat, its polished surface reflecting the dancing flames within. He laid her gently on the thick woolen rug before it, her stillness a stark, fragile contrast to the stove's powerful roar. Then, with painstaking care, he unwrapped the infant. The boy stirred at the sudden warmth, a tiny whimper escaping his lips. He was alive. The relief that washed over Finian was so profound it was dizzying. He found a sturdy sea chest, emptied its contents of charts and instruments, and lined it with his own clean woolens, creating a makeshift cradle which he placed near the life-giving stove. Only then did he allow his full attention to return to the woman. With a basin of hot water from the stove's reservoir and clean linen, he began the grim, delicate task of tending to her. His hands, scarred and hardened by a life of hauling lines and maintaining machinery, moved with an almost reverent care. He cleaned the cuts and abrasions, assessing the damage with a practiced eye. He washed the salt from her hair, the grime from her face, his touch methodical, a silent offering of safety and respect for the life that beat so faintly within her. Outside, the storm howled its protest, throwing sheets of spray against the thick glass of the lantern room high above, but inside, there was only the hiss of the stove, the rhythmic boom of the horn, and the quiet, focused work of a man holding back the tide of death. The hours bled into days, the storm's fury giving way to an exhausted, grey calm. The world outside was a churning expanse of leaden water and sky, but inside the lighthouse, a different kind of quiet settled, heavy with unspoken histories and uncertain futures. Finian moved through his duties with the ingrained precision of a monk. The polishing of the great lens, the winding of the clockwork mechanism that turned the light, the meticulous logging of the weather, these were the rituals that gave his life shape and meaning. But they were no longer solitary. Every action was now underscored by an awareness of his two silent guests. He stoked the stove, brewed thin, nourishing broths, and used a soft cloth dipped in warmed goat's milk to feed the infant, his large fingers impossibly gentle. Lyra drifted in a grey twilight of fever and pain, her consciousness a battered ship on a vast, featureless sea. In her brief moments of lucidity, she would see him, a hulking, quiet shadow moving against the warm glow of the stove. She saw his powerful hands, the hands of a laborer, carefully cradling her son. She saw him sitting in a worn armchair late at night, a heavy book open on his lap, his gaze lifting every few moments to the makeshift cradle, then to her. He never spoke to her, not then. There were no empty reassurances, no prying questions. His care was a language unto itself, spoken in the steady heat of the room, the dry clothes he had dressed her in, the clean bandages that smelled faintly of antiseptic herbs. His silence was a wall, but it was a protective one, shielding her from a world that had sought to crush her. It gave her the space to simply be, to heal without the burden of explanation. One afternoon, she awoke to a different sound, a soft, rhythmic scraping. He was sitting at the small wooden table, a piece of driftwood in one hand and a carving knife in the other. He was shaping it into a seabird, its wings swept back as if caught in a powerful updraft. He didn't look at her, but she felt his awareness of her gaze as his hand stilled for a fraction of a second. Her throat felt like sand, her lips chapped and sore. She tried to make a sound, to form a word of thanks. A dry, rasping cough was all she could manage. He set down his carving without a word, rose, and brought her a cup of water, his arm sliding behind her to lift her head so she could drink. The cool liquid was a miracle. "Thank you," she breathed, the two words a monumental effort, yet in the profound quiet of the circular room, they seemed to resonate like a bell. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, his rugged face unreadable, before returning to his chair and his carving. But the silence had been breached. A single, fragile thread had been spun across the chasm of their solitude, a connection forged not in words, but in a shared moment of simple, human kindness. The great lens high above continued its silent, sweeping turn, casting its beam out over the grey water, a promise of safe harbour in a treacherous world. As the last of the winter storms gave way to the pale, uncertain light of spring, Lyra's strength began to return, a slow tide rising within her. The fever receded, and the world, which had been a blur of pain and shadow, sharpened into focus. She began to sit up, her muscles protesting, and then to stand, her legs trembling like a newborn foal's. She watched Finian, studying the deep-seated quiet of his existence. He was a man who seemed to have absorbed the solitude of the sea, the steadfastness of the rock. He gave her space, an ocean of it, allowing her to heal at her own pace. He had moved the sea-chest cradle next to the cot he had prepared for her, allowing her to be a mother again. She would spend hours just watching her son sleep, his small chest rising and falling, her heart a tight, painful knot of overwhelming love and a cold, familiar terror. The memory of why she had fled, of the man she had been escaping, was a constant, chilling undercurrent. One night, a squall blew in from the north, its fury a pale imitation of the one that had brought her here, but it was enough to mirror the tempest in her soul. The wind howled around the tower, a mournful, searching sound, and the waves crashed against the foundation with a rhythmic, percussive boom. Her son was fretful, his cries sharp and piercing in the enclosed space. As Lyra rocked him, humming a lullaby whose words she could barely remember, the dam of her own silence finally, irrevocably, broke. She began to speak, her voice thin and hesitant at first, cracking with disuse, but it gathered strength as the torrent of words was unleashed. She spoke of Lord Alastair, a man whose ambition was a cold, glittering thing, a man who collected beautiful objects, art, ships, and wives, with the same possessive passion. He was a merchant prince whose influence reached into every corner of the kingdom, and he had decided he would own her. She spoke of a contract signed by her father, a bargain made to settle a ruinous debt, a piece of paper that had signed away her life. She spoke of his cloying compliments that felt like chains, his cold eyes that assessed her worth like a piece of cargo. She had been his prized acquisition, and the birth of her son, an heir he could mold in his own image, had only tightened his grip. The escape had been a desperate, last-minute gamble, a paid-for passage on a smuggler's skiff, a desperate flight into the storm's teeth with the hope of reaching a distant shore where his name meant nothing. Finian sat across the room, by the stove's glow, his carving still in his hands. He did not move. He did not interrupt. He simply listened, his face carved from shadow and firelight, as she unburdened the weight that had been crushing her. When she finally fell silent, her story hanging in the air like sea mist, he slowly rose. He walked to the stove, opened the grate, and fed it another block of seasoned oak. The flames roared to life, a defiant, hungry sound against the storm's lament. He turned and looked at her, his eyes, the grey of a winter sea, holding an emotion she couldn't yet name. "He won't find you here," Finian said, his voice a low rumble, the sound of stone grinding on stone. It wasn't a promise. It was a statement of fact, as solid and immovable as the tower itself. With that, he had drawn a line in the sea, a boundary around their tiny island of light, declaring it a sanctuary. The change in the season seemed to happen overnight, as if the world had finally thrown off a heavy, grey shroud. The relentless churn of the sea softened, its colour shifting from leaden grey to a deep, vibrant blue-green. Gulls returned to nest in the cliffs, their cries sharp and vital. The transformation of the world outside was mirrored by the one taking place within the stone walls of the lighthouse. With the return of her physical strength, Lyra began to reclaim the parts of herself she had thought were lost to the sea or to the fear that had preceded it. She started small, taking over the mending of Finian's rough-spun work shirts, her small, neat stitches an act of quiet gratitude, a way of weaving herself into the fabric of this strange, new life. She took over the cooking, and soon the austere, masculine space was filled with the sense of baking bread made from their stores of flour and savoury fish stews from Finian's catches. She transformed the functional chamber into something softer, something more akin to a home. She would sing to her son, her voice, once a hesitant whisper, growing stronger and clearer each day. The lullabies were no longer broken fragments but full, beautiful melodies that filled the circular room, their notes mingling with the rhythmic sigh of the waves and the cry of the gulls. One evening, Finian presented her with the seabird he had been carving. It was finished, sanded so smooth it felt like polished bone, the grain of the driftwood swirling like feathers. He had drilled a tiny hole through its back and threaded it with a piece of fishing line. Wordlessly, he hung it from a beam over her son's cradle, where it turned and danced in the warm air rising from the stove. It was a gift of immense meaning, a silent acknowledgement that this child, her child, was not just a survivor to be sheltered, but a new life to be cherished. He had carved him a place in his world. Their life fell into a simple, peaceful rhythm, dictated by the sun and the tides. The days were filled with the shared, unspoken work of existence. Lyra tended a small, thriving garden of herbs and hardy vegetables she cultivated in wooden crates filled with soil Finian had hauled up from a sheltered cove. He tended to the light, his primary, sacred duty, and spent his afternoons fishing from the rocks or repairing the endless list of things that the sea and salt sought to destroy. Words remained a scarce commodity between them, but their absence was no longer a void of silence. It was a comfortable, shared space, filled with a deep, mutual understanding. Their bond wasn't being forged in conversation, but in the quiet, repeated rituals of their life. It was in the way he would leave a rare, beautiful seashell on the table for her to find, or the way she would have a hot mug of tea waiting for him when he came down from the lantern room, chilled from the night watch. The fortress was becoming a home, the sanctuary a life, and its two solitary guardians, scarred by their own private storms, were, ever so slowly, becoming a family. The arrival of Silas and his fishing boat was a biannual event, a tenuous link that connected Finian's isolated world to the mainland. He was a gaunt, weather-beaten man who traded salt, flour, and news for Finian's expertly preserved fish. He appeared one bright, calm afternoon, his small boat bobbing gently at the island's crude stone dock, his face unusually grim. Finian greeted him with his customary silent nod and a mug of hot tea. They sat at the small table while Lyra busied herself on the other side of the room, ostensibly sorting herbs, but a cold knot of apprehension was tightening in her stomach. A stranger was a threat, a disruption to the fragile peace she had found. "There's talk on the mainland, Finn," Silas said, his voice low and urgent, his eyes flicking nervously toward Lyra. "A rich man, a lord they call Alistair. His ship has put into port, and his men are asking questions." A lot of questions. Lyra froze, her back to them, her knuckles turning white where she gripped the edge of a wooden crate. "He's telling a sad story," Silas continued, oblivious to her stark reaction. "About his beautiful, young wife. Says she was unwell in the mind. Stole their infant son and fled in the night, took a small boat. He's frantic with worry," he says. Silas took a long sip of his tea. "He's offering a reward. A king's ransom, Finn. For any news of her or the child. Enough to make a man forget his loyalties." Finian's posture did not change. He remained a mountain of stillness, but Lyra, who had learned to read his silences, could feel the sudden, dangerous energy that came off him. It was the stillness of a sky before a lightning strike. "Heard some of his men talking," the fisherman added, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "They know she fled north, into the storm. They're hiring boats to search the islands. He's a man who doesn't like to lose what's his, Finn. And from the way he talks about her, he sees her as his most prized possession." He looked from Finian's stony face to Lyra's rigid back. Understanding, or perhaps suspicion, dawned in his weathered eyes. "You need to be careful," he said, his meaning clear. Silas finished his tea, left his customary parcels of supplies on the table, and was gone as quickly as he had come, his boat a receding speck on the vast, indifferent blue. The silence he left behind was heavy, poisoned. The peace of the island was gone, shattered. The past was no longer a ghost haunting Lyra's memories, it was a hunting party, and it was sailing toward them. The sun seemed less warm, the sea lane somehow menacing. The peace they had so carefully constructed felt like a fragile shell, about to be crushed. The sanctuary was no longer safe. Finian never spoke of Silas's warning, but it pulsed in the air between them, altering the rhythm of their days. It lived in his every action. The next morning, Lyra watched from the high window of the living chamber as he walked the perimeter of the small island, his stride long and purposeful. He wasn't just checking the sea wall, he was studying the treacherous currents, the hidden rocks, the narrow, defensible paths. He was reading the land as a battlefield. He spent the afternoon in his workshop, a small stone shed built into the base of the tower, and the sounds that emerged were not of carving, but of grinding metal. He was sharpening things, knives, a gaffing hook, the head of an old, heavy harpoon. The metallic scrape and screech echoed the tight, mechanical rhythm of Lyra's own heart. He returned and reinforced the thick oak door of the lighthouse, adding a heavy iron bar to the inside. His preparations were a grim, silent conversation, and she understood every unspoken word. Fear, a cold and horribly familiar companion, tried to coil around her throat, stealing her breath. She looked at her son, sleeping peacefully in his cradle, his face serene and utterly trusting. He was the center of this world, the anchor of her life, the reason the sun rose and the lighthouse beam cut through the darkness. The fear receded, burned away by a fiercer, hotter emotion she was only just beginning to recognize as her own, a mother's rage. She would not be a victim again. She would not be dragged back into that gilded cage, would not let her son be raised by that cold, possessive man. She watched Finian, his powerful hands testing the new iron bar, and a new, hard resolve settled in her soul. Later that day, while he was outside, she went to the large sea chest where he kept tools and old maritime equipment. Her hand searched past coils of rope and blocks of tallow until they found it, a heavy, iron belaying pin, its surface worn smooth with age and use, designed to secure heavy rigging in a gale. She picked it up. Its weight was substantial, solid, alien in her hand. The cold iron was a shock against her skin. But she held it, practiced gripping it, swinging it. The unfamiliarity gave way to a grim determination. She was no longer the broken creature washed ashore. This lighthouse was her home. This child was her life. This quiet, steadfast man was her protector. And she would fight to the death to defend them all. The sanctuary was no longer just a place of healing. It had become a fortress, and she, its unlikely chatelaine, was now its second guard, ready for the siege. The day Lord Alastair came was preternaturally calm. The sea was a sheet of polished glass, the sky a vast, empty blue. There was no wind, not even the whisper of a breeze. Only a heavy, expectant silence that felt more menacing than any storm. Finian had been watching the horizon since dawn, a sentinel at the lantern room's railing, a spyglass to his eye. He saw the ship first, a sleek, black-hulled vessel that cut through the water with arrogant speed, its sails full of a wind that did not seem to exist anywhere else. He descended the winding stairs, his face a mask of granite. "Go inside. Bar the door. Stay away from the windows," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. It was the first direct command he had ever given her. She nodded, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The belaying pin was tucked into the waistband of her dress, its heavy presence a cold, solid comfort. She gathered her son, her hands trembling despite her resolve, and retreated to the deepest shadows of the room, whispering reassurances to the child that she could not feel herself. Outside, the ship dropped anchor 100 yards from the shore. A longboat was lowered, and 3 men rowed to the island's small dock. Alastair disembarked, his movements crisp and proprietary. He was as handsome as she remembered, but it was the cold, predatory beauty of a hawk. "Finian the keeper," he bellowed, his voice accustomed to command, echoing unnaturally in the still air. "I know you have her. I have a writ of possession. She is my wife, and that child is my son. I have come to collect my property." Finian stood on the stone walkway before the lighthouse door, his immense frame blocking the entrance. He held the long, heavy-bladed gaffing hook in one hand, its steel point gleaming in the sun. "They ain't your property," he replied, his voice a low growl that carried easily across the water. "And they ain't leaving." Alastair laughed, a sharp, ugly sound of disbelief. "You dare defy me, you pathetic rock-dweller? She belongs to me by law and by contract." He gestured to his 2 hired men, who began to fan out, drawing short, heavy swords. "This can be easy, or it can be bloody. Your choice." The world seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a snarl of frustrated fury, Alastair gave the order. "Get them." The explosion of violence was sudden and shocking. The calm air was split by the clash of steel and guttural shouts. It was chaos, a blur of desperate motion and sound, but Finian moved with the brutal efficiency of a bear defending its territory. He used the gaff hook not as a blade, but as an extension of his own powerful arms, hooking, tripping, and shoving, using his intimate knowledge of the treacherous, rock-strewn ground to his advantage. The fight was a maelstrom of close-quarters combat. Finian was a force of nature, strong and unyielding, but he was outnumbered. He managed to disarm one of the men, sending his sword skittering into a deep crevice, but the other one closed in, a flash of steel and grunting fury. They crashed to the ground, a tangle of limbs and raw, desperate violence. From inside, Lyra could hear the grunts of exertion, the sickening thud of fists on flesh, the scrape of boots on rock. She clutched her son, her whole body trembling, a silent scream trapped in her throat. Through a narrow slit window, she saw Alastair, his face a mask of cold rage, bypass the brawl and charge directly for the lighthouse door. He didn't care about the fight, he cared about his prize. The heavy oak door groaned as he slammed his shoulder against it. Once. Twice. On the third impact, the wood around the lock splintered. With a final, furious kick, the door flew open, and he was inside. His shadow fell over her, his eyes wild with possessive madness. "There you are, my little runaway," he hissed, his gaze fixing on the child in her arms. He lunged, not for her, but for her son. In that instant, time seemed to slow, the frantic hammering of her heart becoming a low, steady beat. The terror in Lyra's veins turned to ice, then to fire. The broken, helpless creature who had washed ashore was gone, burned away in the crucible of her fear and her love. In her place stood a mother. As Alistair's manicured hands reached for her child, she moved. She drew the heavy belaying pin from her waist. Its cold, solid weight was no longer alien, it was an extension of her own will. She screamed, a sound she didn't recognize, a primal roar of pure, undiluted defiance, and swung the iron pin with all the force of her body, striking his outstretched arm. The sound was a sickening crack of bone. He roared in pain and shock, stumbling back, staring at the ruin of his arm and then at her, as if seeing her for the very first time. It was not a warrior's blow, but it was enough. It was everything. It was the moment she took her life back. Just as Alistair recovered, his face contorting in a mask of murderous rage as he raised his uninjured hand to strike her, the doorway was filled by a new figure. It was Silas, the fisherman, and behind him stood two other grim-faced men from the mainland, their fishing gaffs held like weapons. The fight outside had ceased. Finian, bruised but victorious, stood over the two disarmed and defeated men. The power had shifted, not just by Finian's brute strength, but by Lyra's unexpected courage and the arrival of a world beyond the island that would no longer allow Alistair to write his own laws. "It's over, my lord," Silas said, his voice ringing with a newfound authority. "You'll be coming with us." The silence that descended on the island in the aftermath was different. It was not the silence of isolation or the taut silence of impending doom, but a deep, profound peace that settled into the very stones of the lighthouse. Silas and his men took a whimpering, defeated Alistair and his lackeys away, their boat a dark stain fading into the sunset. Finian, his face a map of new bruises and his knuckles split and bleeding, barred the broken door, then turned to face Lyra. She was still trembling, the iron belaying pin fallen at her feet, her son clutched so tightly to her chest he began to fuss. Their eyes met across the room, and in that long, silent gaze, volumes were spoken. He saw not a fragile refugee, but a warrior queen who had defended her throne. She saw not just a stoic protector, but a partner who had stood with her against the darkness. Wordlessly, they moved to tend to each other's wounds. Her touch as she cleaned the cut on his brow with a damp cloth was as gentle as his had been on her battered body all those months ago. He, in turn, examined her hands, uncurling her fingers from the fists they had become, making sure she was unharmed. The lighthouse, once a simple sanctuary from the storm, was now consecrated as a true home, its foundations reinforced by their shared struggle and sealed by their mutual, unspoken devotion. Spring had fully claimed the island, painting the cliff faces with resilient wildflowers and turning the sea to a shade of brilliant turquoise. The air was sweet with the scent of salt and blooming thrift. They worked together to repair the door, their hands often brushing, their quiet rhythm restored, but forever changed, deepened by the fire they had walked through together. A few weeks later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and rose, Finian stood with Lyra on the lantern room gallery, the highest point of their small kingdom. The sea and sky stretched out before them, vast and peaceful. Her son, now babbling and bright-eyed, was nestled securely in a sling on her chest. He reached out and took her hand. His large, calloused fingers intertwined with hers, a perfect, solid fit. "You belong here now," he said again. The words were the same as the one she had first heard him speak in her fevered dreams, but their meaning had been utterly transformed. It was no longer a declaration of rescue, a keeper's claim on a piece of jetsam. It was a question, an offer, an invitation to build a life together, anchored to this rock, illuminated by this light. Lyra looked at his strong, kind face, etched with lines of past sorrows but now softened by a quiet hope. She looked out at the home they had defended, at the child who was their shared future. She squeezed his hand, her answer clear and strong. "Yes," she said, her voice carrying on the gentle evening breeze. "We belong here now." This story is a testament to the resilient strength of the human spirit and the profound power of hope to find purchase in the most desolate of landscapes. It speaks to the idea that a family is not always born of blood, but is often forged in the fires of shared adversity, built through acts of quiet courage, unwavering protection, and mutual respect. Lyra's journey from a terrified fugitive to a fierce defender of her own life shows us that our deepest scars do not have to dictate our futures, they can become the sources of our greatest strength. And in Finian, we see that a home is not merely a structure of stone and iron, but a space of safety and acceptance carved out of the world by a steadfast heart. Their love story wasn't written in grand pronouncements or passionate poetry, it was written in shared silence, in the mending of wounds both seen and unseen, and in the mutual promise to stand as a beacon against the darkness, together. If this story of survival, resilience, and the quiet building of a new life moved you, let us know in the comments below. Your own stories of finding sanctuary and strength are a source of inspiration for our entire community. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more emotional and inspirational stories that explore the depths of the human spirit. And please tap that notification bell so you never miss a moment of hope. Thank you for watching.